Hi guys, welcome back to my next episode. Based on the same digital sketch, I painted two pieces, one in watercolor and the other in gouache. This portrait features my two original characters, two girls, a warrior and a priestess. I love how these characters look together in one piece, contrasting yet complementing each other. Based on the same plot, I wanted to draw it in two completely different styles, using different approaches to the execution of each version in terms of graphic expression, color, and lighting. In many ways, this look is determined by the tools I used: traditional paints, gouache, and watercolor. If I had done this portrait digitally, that would be some other approach, and this portrait would have looked different. Since the work turned out to be extensive and there is a lot of material which I feel is really interesting and needed to talk about, I divided the process into two parts. In today's video, I will show how I worked on this portrait with watercolor, and in the next video from this series, how I worked on these characters with gouache. So, if you're not yet an experienced watercolorist but want to know a bit more about basic features and techniques of watercolor painting, as well as other things that will make the painting process for you more comfortable and dramatically improve your result, for example, how to stretch the paper to ensure it doesn't warp while painting, then let's get started. For this piece, I made a sketch digitally. This way, I reduced the time spent on the sketch. Digital tool allows correcting the work an infinite number of times. Doing the same sketch with a pencil, I would have wasted much more time and possibly some sheets of paper. In digital format, you don't have to start from scratch every time you need to move characters on the sheet or correct something. You can easily change the composition, adjust or completely change the appearance of characters, correct anatomy errors. Try every option that comes to mind, consider them and choose the best one, and all this without stress, without worrying about wasted time or wasted paper. This doesn't mean I don't enjoy drawing traditionally. I love drawing with pencil. I don't think digital technology can completely replace the experience of traditional sketching. But if you're planning a work involving more than one subject, digital technology is a magical time saver. I also colored my sketch in black and white, just like I do with charcoal, and this gave me a clear action plan, a painting roadmap in terms of values. After the sketch is ready, the first step in any watercolor work is preparing the paper. In my case, I prefer to stretch the paper onto a stretcher. Yes, stretching the paper takes some time, but with some experience and wood stapler, everything will be quite simple. Of course, I want to start painting as quickly as possible, and all these preparations can be a little annoying, but the result cannot be underestimated. Stretching the paper significantly improves the quality of your final work. First, you need to soak the paper. I use a white soft brush that absorbs a lot of water. It's a Chinese goat hair brush, it's very soft and doesn't damage the paper, and it's not at all expensive. But you can also use any soft synthetic brush. The water should be at room temperature, not hot. I use the lid of a plastic box that I keep especially for this purpose. I bought it at IKEA. I do everything possible to avoid damaging the paper. I work carefully but thoroughly. First I soak the paper on one side, then turn it over and soak the other side, leaving no dry spots. I pour enough water to cover paper by about 2 to 3 millimeters so that the paper floats in water. After this, the paper needs to be left for a few minutes in water. The thicker the paper, the longer we leave it in the water. I leave my 300 GSM paper in the water for 10 to 15 minutes. I must definitely mention that this process is relevant for paper made of 100% cotton. Paper with a different composition will behave differently. In general, I pay attention to the condition of the paper. If the paper has stopped warping and lies flat when it's ready, the fibers of the material have relaxed, and in this relaxed state the paper will stretch evenly over the stretcher. When drying, the paper will shrink just like fabric. It will fit well on the stretcher and will no longer warp while you paint. Now that my paper is ready, I let the water drain and stretch the paper over the stretcher. I stretch the paper on an inexpensive stretcher, similar to the kind you can buy at your local supermarket in the stationery department for school art. That's the method I've come up with. This method is for you if you want to try stretching paper on a stretcher bar and find out if this is right for you, but don't want to spend money on an expensive stretcher. Of course, it's better to find a more reliable stretcher online from a good art store, since those inexpensive ones aren't exactly reliable. Perhaps I will do that in the future. I arrange the paper as it should be in the end, and it must be done carefully and precisely, as nothing can be changed after this process. I start in the center of one side, fold the paper over and use a stapler. Then I move to the opposite side, tighten the paper just enough to remove any slack and staple it in the center. Then I do the same on the other two sides. Don't stretch the paper too tightly on the stretcher, otherwise it may even tear after drying and shrinking, especially with thinner paper than in this case. Also, don't stretch it too loosely, otherwise the wet paper may still warp while you paint. But even if this happens, don't worry. After drying, it will become smooth again and your painting will not warp. I tried stretching the paper in different ways. I laid it on a flat plastic surface, thoroughly wet both sides so it would stick, and painted using the wet on wet technique. This method works if you paint very quickly, as the paper dries out and stops sticking to the surface so thoroughly, and it's no longer possible to wet it, otherwise you will wash away the work. Another quick way to stretch paper that we all know is to tape the paper around the edges. I've tried different types of tape. Some ruin the paper, others don't hold it well, and in all of these cases, in my opinion, no other method for portrait painting has given me the same result as stretching the paper on a stretcher. In the beginning, I used push pins to fasten paper, but it was very difficult and took much longer. I had to hammer the pins into the wood with hammer, otherwise I couldn't push them in with my fingers. The pins broke, my fingers got tired, and I wasn't thrilled. So a stapler is magic. But please read the instruction carefully before using a stapler and use it with all due caution. It's a very cool, convenient tool, but never point the hole where the staples come out, not at yourself or others. Protect your eyes and fingers. Always keep the stapler on the safety catch and out of reach of children and animals. Now I need to let my paper dry. Usually it takes a few hours. It's best to lay it horizontally, but if you lean it against the wall, it's not a problem. Just remember to turn it over from time to time to ensure even drying. Don't use a hairdryer as this can warp the frame. Since I love to start painting on wet paper, I don't even let the paper dry completely. I make sure that the paper fits tightly enough on the stretcher and start painting. First of all, you need to decide on the colors, and this is where I try my mixtures for the work. I'll use this green-yellow color for aged jewelry. I mixed some of my yellows and blues with some blacks to tone down the brightness, and it wasn't always the same yellows, blues, and blacks. I actively used my large watercolor palette and changed the colors, the paints, depending on the situation. I will use this light blue based on the pigment blue 15 to create soft reflected light, and will also from time to time will mix it with lemon yellow or warm yellow. This will be a medium skin tone to neutralize the mid-tone skin tone and make it a color for some light shadows, not all shadows, but some of them. I add there a blue mixture I already have. Light is reflected. The colors of objects are always interact with each other, and the shadow colors always contains some of the surrounding colors. Using this principle allows you to make your painting look more interesting and realistic. Here I have my lightest color that will be used in this painting, and I'm trying it out to combine with a dark greenish yellow and black mixture right on the paper. I layer it. I'll use it for the jewelry. And here are my darkest dark tones. There are mixtures of Prussian blue, ultramarine blue, some blacks, and I also like to add a bit of red, especially alizarin crimson, because the purple that results this way looks rich and the darkest tone. I will use the same reds and blues in their transparent form with a lot of water in the illuminated areas of the painting, and this way the overall tone of the painting is united. Now I'm using a liquid masking film. I have this one from Talents to reserve white areas that will be highlights and which should never be painted over. Before use, it's good to mix the reserving liquid thoroughly so that it becomes uniformly liquid and lies on the paper evenly and thinly. If you have a thin brush that you hate, this is the exact brush that you need to apply masking fluid, because after that you will no longer be able to paint with this brush. It will be reserved for the masking fluid. This part where these two characters are colliding and that I cover with masking fluid right now isn't only the highlight on the hair. In this case, the masking fluid will serve to ensure that the deep dark wash of paint I'll be applying to fabric covering the priestess head, it's the girl on the left, will not spread in any way onto the hair of the girl on the right, the empress, whose hair will be very light. Before you start watercolor painting, it's important to have a ready-made plane of painting, to think about all these things in advance. Next, I used a hairdryer on cold air mode to speed up the drying of the reserve liquid. The hairdryer must be kept at a distance of at least 20 centimeters from the paper to avoid over-drying individual areas. These are general rules, and even the wettest paper should not be dried with a hairdryer for more than 50 seconds at a time. What I'm doing now is applying clean water with a clean soft brush to the areas that I'm about to fill with the most transparent underpainting. This will be the underpainting for skin tone. This way I prepare these areas. I don't make them so wet that the water drops just run off, but only damp enough for the edges of the underpainting to blur. I start to paint with a reflected light. It appears from somewhere below. It will be on the clothes of the characters, on their faces and jewelry. It's mystical, unusual, and even a little scary. I use one of the main mixtures for this painting, the light blue-green one. The participants of this mix are Yellow Lake by Sennelier on pigment yellow 150 and Cerulean Blue Phthalo by Van Gogh on pigment blue 15 and white 6. There may be some additional colors depending on the situation, but these are the main ones that are always presented. The reflected light is that type of lighting that amateur artists most often forget about, as it is the least obvious lighting. Meanwhile, adding reflected light to a painting adds interest and helps highlight the object's form. The same applies to any lighting: direct light, rim light, diffuse light. Without using multiple light sources, objects appears less three-dimensional. In my experience, 2 to 3 light sources are quite sufficient for the main subject on a painting. Shadows are never dark. If you look closely, you can easily see that even the darkest shadow has a shade, that is, it contains reflected light. Now I'm adding lemon yellow to this mixture and going to use it to paint jewelry. I make a few basic transparent washes to distribute the colors and create an underpainting. Basically, there are two methods to start your painting. You can start with the background or with the character, with the main object. Try both methods. For example, you can first fill in the background and let it dry before moving to more detailed character drawing. This will help avoid unnecessary color blending and blurring of character details that need to remain sharp where they meet the background. It also helps you to build tones, so you can quickly see the entire work and easily determine the darkest and lighter tones. This method is suitable if your background is saturated with different colors or should be very dark. In the case with this exact painting, it was more convenient for me to start with the characters, since I had here very little background, but the characters on the other hand take up most of the space in the painting. So, starting with the characters helps my painting come together faster. Try both methods. You'll quickly get a feel for how they work for you. And of course, if you have a lighter tone as an undertone, underpainting, start with these light tones so that later you can layer more saturated, darker, deeper tones on top of them. As for the colors I use in my portraits, you can find my palette for watercolor portraits in my 2 previous videos on this topic. I'll leave links to them below in the description. Now deep blue tones are coming onto the scene, like Prussian blue and ultramarine blue. I add them to the existing mix. They will help me paint dark reflections on the metal. I want my edges to be soft, so the technique I'm using is still wet on wet. If you want your next layer to blend into the previous one, start painting without letting the previous layer dry completely. You can even slightly dampen the already dried layer with water using a soft clear brush. Just be careful not to remove the existing paint layer, unless that's your goal. However, if you don't want the brush strokes on the next layer to blend or blur, you want to keep them sharp, you can begin painting only over an already dried layer. You can use a hair dryer to save some time. On damp paper, colors blend and bleed easily. This can be both an advantage and disadvantage. Use this property as your advantage. Now it's time to wash the palette so I can mix and paint the mid-tone skin tone. My medium skin tone here is a mixture where the prevalent color is Indian Yellow by Rembrandt, based on pigment yellow 154 and orange 48. I also changed the water. Don't forget to change the water often, since in watercolor we're essentially paint with water. If your water is no longer transparent, it means you're adding all these shades in your water to your current fills. This isn't bad if that's the effect you want to achieve, but if not, don't forget to change the water. A little later I add a medium red, very transparent with a lot of water for those areas of her face where the skin is more reddish pink. For painting deeper shadows on her face and neck, I add a bit of pink violet from Van Gogh based on pigment violet 19. Since the reflected light here has a blue undertone and a girl has a light warm skin tone that has some red in it, when mixed with the blue of the shadows, it will produce a violetish hue. Here in the shadows on her forehead, a green tint appears. It's because of reflected light. The light reflects from her jewelry on her forehead, and this metal has a greenish tint. Now with each new layer I deepen the tone where I need it. On the places I need to soften the edges, I do it with a damp soft brush or add a bit of water with a clean brush. But in general, now I'm already painting on a slightly dry layer, where the paper has dried while I was working on other areas. Now it's time to paint her hair. From cold colors of this painting, I move to warm ones. I wet this area with a clean damp brush, and the colors I use are yellows and reds, all are pretty warm colors. And the star of this mixture is Transparent Pearl Orange by Daniel Smith, based on pigment orange 71. Now it's time to add reds. It's alizarin crimson and similar fairly medium reds, somewhere closer maybe to brownish tone. Now I'm going to go for a quick pit stop, just make myself a cup of coffee and we'll get back to you right away. I hope you're already having a beverage of your preference, or you can paint with me. Hello, I'm finally back. In my universe, half of hour has passed, so I managed to drink my hot coffee and had some sandwiches. I hope you're doing fine. My coffee was delicious and strong, so I'm full of strength and determination to continue telling you my story, especially since we have ahead the most beautiful part of this painting. And very soon, the work will finally begin to come together into a complete picture. Now I move to the second character. The process of painting is basically the same. If the girl on the right represents the light and warm tone on my painting, then the girl on the left represents the cool tone and shadows. This creates a beautiful contrast between these characters. Now we will speed things a lot. I've already told you about the main nuances of the work I wanted to share today, and besides, I want to post this video today, not in a month. Coffee definitely makes me less patient. You may notice that I always have a clean napkin to my right. These are absolutely usual, basic, quite soft paper napkins, but they are absolutely essential for painting. I use them to remove excess water or excess paint from my brushes. So far, I really like how this painting turning out. I like how the colors flow into one another, and that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. Here I'm using a very useful and beautiful technique to create soft highlights on an already finished layer. With a damp, clean brush, I go over the paper to lift some of the paint on some areas. These highlights won't be contrasting, they will be very soft. The main thing is not to overdo it. It's important to use a soft brush and not overdo it so as not to damage the paper, because wet paper is especially easy to damage. Depending on how staining the used paints are, the highlights will be more or less noticeable. There are colors, for example ultramarine blue, which is pretty easy to remove even after drying with a clean damp brush. And on the other hand, on the other side, there are very staining colors that can be barely lifted completely even while they're still wet. In general, less staining colors are less transparent, rather opaque, and granulating colors that contain large pigment particles that are easy to remove. Warm reds are likely not to be much staining. On the other hand, violets are very staining colors, as well as cool reds and magenta. Colors that have a prefix of phthalo are also very staining. Very staining are yellows with the word quinacridone in the name, such as Indian yellow. And all in all, synthetic paints are always much more staining than paints that made from natural materials. To sum up, I think it's wrong to say that mistakes cannot be corrected in watercolors. On the contrary, in many cases you just need to understand the properties of the pigments you use and act immediately. Don't delay correcting the mistake and remove excess paint with a clean damp brush while the paint is still wet. While natural brushes or imitation of natural brushes are good for fillings, for deep color, soft blending, then the thin synthetic brush is my choice for painting fine details, fine lines and small elements. Because a synthetic brush will be stiffer than a natural brush and it will hold less water, it gives some more control and it's more predictable. For the background, I use a very granulated mixture of blues. I love this effect and even thinking about purchasing a few more granulating colors from Daniel Smith for this purpose, for my backgrounds. Now, when the painting is pretty much done, I'm finally removing the masking fluid with a soft eraser. I have an eraser from Faber-Castell. Of course, for this purpose it's much better to have a kneadable art eraser or a putty rubber, but mine has dried out completely and I don't have a new one yet. And then I'll add the finishing touches. I draw a little over these highlights that were reserved to unite these areas with the rest of the painting. Well, my work is already done. Thank you for watching to the very end and for support this video, because I'm sure you will give this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see the continuation, because in the next video I will show you how I draw this sketch but with gouache. Thank you so much for watching again and have a wonderful day or night. Bye bye!